artist. Can you hear me? I'm sorry. I hate these things. And Ming-Jer Kuo, our recent award winners from the New York Foundation of the Arts Awards in Architecture and Environmental Structures and Design. They've both been rewarded such other awards for their practice as image makers, as photographers, and artists. But this is kind of a crossover, and we were very proud that actually we had 2 winners in that category, another winner in another category, and several runners-up in the New York Foundation of the Arts. Okay. So that sparked the idea that we ought to make this focus on this idea of architecture and urban design. This said, well, we need an interlocutor. Who should we get? I said, Shan, my friend Shan Jayakumar, who I just saw on the street after not seeing him for a number of years, just happened to pass me on the street. I first met Shan in a different context, a more tragic one, but it was about architecture too, rather than the destruction of architecture, rather than the destruction of urban environments. Had to do with the destruction of the Twin Towers in 2001. He came to volunteer at the project called Here's New York, which was muscled by SVA and others, and stayed for, God knows how long he stayed. We were there a long time. And he was, I think, a student at that time, or just graduated. Right? So that's 18 years ago. So with no further ado, he is an architectural planner, professor, lectured high other major schools, teaches at the New York Institute of Technology, and is an architect planner. So, Sean, I'm giving you the microphone and retiring.
Thank you, Charles and Liz and the SVA MFA program here for organizing this talk and welcoming us, myself, and the 2 artists that are going to speak tonight about specifically the lens-based work as a foundation towards architecture and design. So it's a theme that we'll be coming back to tonight to help guide our discussion. So just by way of introduction, Shimon Attie is a professor here and a visual artist whose practice includes creating permanent and temporary site-specific installations in public places, immersive mixed media installations for museums and galleries, art, photographs, and new media works. In many of his projects, Shimon has used a variety of media to animate sites with images of lost histories, specifically focusing on the idea of memory and speculative futures. This has included introducing the histories of narratives of marginalized and forgotten communities into the physical landscape of the present. In other, often video works, Attie engages local communities, and that's another theme of today's talk, will be how we can engage the public in a better way, in finding new ways of representing their history, memory, and potential futures. The other speaker tonight, Ming-Jer Kuo, born in Taipei, Taiwan, is a New York-based artist. He has worked as an environmental engineer for 11 years before coming to New York for his art. He creates interdisciplinary visual artworks based on his lens-based media experience, urban design interests, and engineer's perspective. He's a graduate of the MFA program here, and he has won additional awards to the NYFA, such as the Elizabeth Foundation Award. And he will speak about some of his more recent work that led to the NYFA grant. So I'd like to invite Shimon as the first speaker this evening.
Well, thank you all for coming. It's fun to be at SVA. I'm usually not here in the fall, so I'm usually here in the spring, so it's just fun to mix it up. Okay, Shimon. So, I've probably realized, hold on one second. Of course I didn't bring my glasses, one, two, no, that's all right, it's all beautiful. Okay. Cool. So since I got my MFA in 1991, I've probably realized about 30 projects in maybe about 10 countries on several continents. I'm only going to show you whatever it was, 4 or 5 projects, very specifically thinking about the frame of tonight's presentations and conversation in terms of the relationship of photography, lens-based, media-based art with architecture, neighborhoods, cityscapes, and in my case I also threw in landscape, a natural landscape as well. This is one of my early projects. It's from my project called The Writing on the Wall. What you're looking at is a color photograph that I took of a building in Berlin's former Jewish quarter, one of Berlin's former Jewish quarters, with a photograph that I slide projected onto the building's facade that was taken there in 1930, that one. So there was a Hebrew bookstore that was located exactly at this address 60 years before I did this project. And so if you see the color photographs in a museum or gallery, you say it's photography. If you see it on site, you say this is a public project or a site-specific installation. That's another way in which I sort of mix up media and marry photography together with other media, beyond the issue of architecture and cityscapes and neighborhoods. So that project involved a lot of research and figuring out where those photographs were taken 60 years ago, etc. So that was, slide projection of a former Hebrew bookstore. This is the early 90s, right after the Berlin Wall came down. And needless to say, I probably should just remind all of us what happened to the Jewish residents of this neighborhood, which is that most of them were deported to death camps. And it was a poor neighborhood. This one was very poor. So not many people immigrated to the United States from this neighborhood or elsewhere. So it was kind of an early impulse in me in terms of if buildings could speak, if cobblestone streets could speak their history. In art school, my focus was photography, but it was very porous, the boundaries between photography and installation art. And so I think primarily I'm an installation artist, and I say that because it's very important for me to touch and to activate and animate actual places and spaces. A lot of stuff can be mocked up with Photoshop, etc. But there's something central to my artistic impulse where I need to be out in the neighborhoods intervening. This is a project, I don't show this project very often, but it's very relevant to our talk tonight. It's an early project I did in New York, in the Lower East Side. I don't know if any of you were living here in 1998, but if you were, you might remember this piece. I'm just going to play a couple of minutes from the BBC piece on it.
In some ways, most wonderfully, when it gets to the synagogue, it's going
Shimon Attie is preparing to make his mark on Manhattan. Over the last 4 months, he's talked to residents about their memories of the neighborhood, as well as their own stories, superstitions, and dreams. He spent more than 2 years planning a laser art installation that will take place here in the heart of the Lower East Side, an area influenced by generations of Jewish, Hispanic, and Chinese immigrants.
I very much respond to spaces and to places, and by temperament, I'm very interested in memory. And how do we give visual form to something so, on one hand, so intangible, and ethereal, but on the other hand, something very real for us.
Shimon found his answer with lasers. Words made of light scroll across the architecture in real time, moving from building to building. Fragments of thoughts, poems, songs are all made visible on the street, some in English, others in Yiddish, Mandarin, or Spanish, the languages of this community. It's a major art project that required a lot of coordination and backing.
We couldn't imagine a better marriage for public art of really
The
studying
lovely
the
Ann
public with
Pasternak,
great
who's now the
visuals
director of the
and providing
Ribbon
them
Museum.
with content that was incredibly thoughtful
She
and
was my
appealing.
producer back then.
Shimon says that the lasers help animate his project.
The quality of laser light mirrors how memory itself functions. lasers, they're very intense light, very focused, so they appear to have a presence. And yet, after all, it's just a light.
So, and you can even see that I was attempting formally to respond to some of the architectural motifs and designs as sort of a blending between language and language, memory, community, and architecture. Those would probably be the four, and of course, immigration. And that video piece was good at showing the write-out technique that we developed, the animation technique, but it was not so good in showing the very dramatic scope of the project, the breadth of it. It was 2 city blocks. So let me move on. Just a couple pieces from a more recent project, Facts on the Ground, which I realized in Israel and Palestine. I have a long history with that part of the world. And it was site-specific lightbox pieces that I conceived, created, and installed in order to be photographed. So for this project, I was really thinking about the end photographs, first and foremost in my mind. Wild and urgent. This is sited at a Israeli settlement, what most of the world would call an illegal settlement in occupied territories in the West Bank. And I was using language as well to create a discourse that was difficult to interpret. Am I being critical? Am I being congratulatory? Am I being ironic? Etc. Unlike Euphoria, this is in Tel Aviv. This is the site where the late Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated for trying to make peace with the Palestinians in the Oslo Peace Accords. He was assassinated in 1995. Landlord. We're on the edge of a Palestinian village, annexed and occupied by Israel, looking on to what most of the world would say is an illegal settlement, what many Israelis would say is a new neighborhood in East Jerusalem. But in any case, when I made reference to natural landscape, this is what I was referring to in terms of trying to use visual art, language, and technology to excavate and make manifest ideological impulses that are latent but not visible in the landscape around us. All of one's fears. This is in Tel Aviv again. This is a mosque. Actually, it's the ruins of a mosque on the left, the orange-lit building. Basically, it's an archaeology site. And it has pot marks in it that you might be able to see. And it was attacked by rioting Israelis during one of the Palestinian uprisings. It wasn't even a functioning mosque, it's just an archaeology site. And on the right is a synagogue, a Jewish house of worship. That's what they look like in this neighborhood, Kfar Shalom in southeast Tel Aviv. And all of one's fears is my intervention. Sort of triangulating, sort of like I was trying to sort of speak about that sort of projective identification and negative identification where I will be, you are my worst fear, then you become my worst fear and I become your worst fear and you become my worst fear and you kind of mirror back each other's worst fears about the other. A problem in logic. I mean, there's a whole, like A.L. Weitzman, there's a whole genre about sort of the architecture of occupation. And so here, this is like Abu Dis in the West Bank that's sort of divided against itself because of the separation wall. Okay, so Night Watch, much more recent now. It is true that I'm just being honest. So I did get the NYFA grant in architecture, environmental structures, and design, but I wasn't going to apply because I didn't think it didn't make sense. And then a woman who I know at NYFA said, "Oh, Shimon, give it a try anyway." So I was very surprised that I got it in that category, but it made sense. So I'm going to just show you. Now how does this work? Wait a minute. There we go. Okay. And my producer is here, Michaela Martigani from moreart.org. It was a floating media installation. Is it a year ago now? Almost exactly a year ago, right next week. That circulated in the waterways around Manhattan and Brooklyn. a barge with a large, that was pushed by a tugboat. Just because of our time, let me see if I can scrub forward. No, I don't want to do that. I just wanted to scrub. Okay. Excuse me. So it was a barge with about a 20-foot wide high-resolution screen on it with a 9-minute looping film. And the film were silent video portraits of 12 new New Yorkers, 12 individuals who had their lives saved by receiving political asylum by the U.S. government, and they live in New York City. So it's a distinct counter-narrative to our current zeitgeist about refugees and immigrants, etc., and asylum seekers. Most of them were from the LGBT community. A couple were unaccompanied minors at the border. Two of the most vulnerable groups. And it circulated for about 8 nights. And each of the people in the film have amazing stories to tell, sometimes horrific. Some of them survived horrific violence and near death in their home countries and fled for their lives. Of course, the photographer in me, the videographer in me, was very keen about some of these architectural juxtapositions in terms of the way that some of these monuments or these structures resonate with the issue with American history about welcoming new immigrants. And the way I framed this piece for NYFA was that it was a way of it was place marking. It was marking the waterways around New York City as sites, both physical sites and metaphors for immigration, rescue, fleeing for one's life, being welcomed and given a safe harbor, etc. So it was about place marking. And just so you can see a little bit of the production, now let me just see, why don't I see Okay, I don't see an arrow. I'm just going to show you 1 or 2 minutes of the actual film that was played on the barge. It opens with that James Baldwin quote you just saw, "We contain the other hopelessly and forever." He's a Russian asylee. He happens to be an artist, actually. And all of the people who participated in the project, they had their asylum applications approved anywhere from about, let's say, 3 months before the filming to 2 years before the filming. And many of my moving image pieces have we use a lighting that's akin to old master painting lighting in terms of the shadowing and the way the highlights are rendered and the three-dimensional wraparound of the body, rather than like a cooler, more neutral register. She was an unaccompanied minor at the border. So they would just come towards the camera. I told them to try to remove all expression and to create kind of a neutral eye-thou encounter with the viewer. So the emotional goods are not handed over. The viewer's left to sort of struggle and make meaning of who these people are. I was trying to interrupt the process. We sometimes project onto refugees and asylees or victims of various kinds that we might feel sympathetic, or we might feel repulsed. We might have a number of different feelings, and I wanted to interrupt that. I don't know if you can read this. It looks a little. For the fortunate few who've been granted political asylum in the U.S., 11 of these individuals appear in this piece. And then, of course, being the photographer that ultimately I always am, I tried to make hopefully compelling photographs that can live on their own after the installation is finished. Depends on the nature of a given project, how possible that is or not. Sometimes it can just be straightforward documentation. How are we with time? Am I good? Oh, good. So, when I first started thinking about this talk, I was perhaps thinking about it also in a broader way, not so specific just to architecture, but I was thinking about art's ability and lens-based practices' ability to dialogue with a number of disciplines across the humanities, political and social history, community studies, international human rights. I mean, these are the kinds of things that I think about a lot. Well, I don't mind ending a little early, so that leaves more time for other things. So thank you very much.
Hi everybody, I'm Ming-Jer Kuo. So I graduated in 2014, and I think it's a great honor to be here again as a speaker. So thank you everybody. So I was really lucky to get this fellowship actually, because I was in the visa chaos, international students, and you graduated, you need a working visa or something. Then suddenly you got into some great things and got rejected again. So I have to make back and forth, and luckily I got this fellowship and take this chance to come back again. So I don't really. For this talk, I don't think I will really focus on architecture or something. I will just do the recap on my art career, I guess. As Shan mentioned, I was working as an environmental engineer for 11 years. So this photo is what I taken when I took the first time have the helicopter when I was working. It's 2004, I guess. And it's the first photograph I've taken from the helicopter. And after that, I graduated, I quit the job on 2010 because before that I worked on the photographs and my work, and I couldn't go on, so suddenly I think I had to make a decision to make a U-turn for my life. So I quit the job and work on this project. It's about all the landscape in my neighborhood. So the project's about in Taipei it's so compact, so people put their belongings on the street, and so it's kind of blurring the public space and the private space. So at this moment, I'm still working as a photographer, I would say. So it's shooting in 4x5, and I enlarge on my own in the color darkroom. And the second project is what I've done in before I came here. I was luckily I got into this program, and before that I think, yeah, I should do something. So I started this project, but it's actually there's no Photoshop. So it's how the residents coexist with the nature. It's not like the American way, because you have a lot of space, but in Taiwan, in Taipei, especially Taipei, we is so compact. So with those trees, they try to live with the trees and in all kinds of ways. And then it moved to the 2011. I first came here, and this is the first project I made at school, and because the scale of the city is so different in New York than Taipei, because it's so like an international metropolis. So I'm still, when I was first arrived, I tried to do something what I've done before, but I don't think that works. So I moved to the digital photography and try to make these projects about I want to put all the workers together to show the reason to drive this city. And during the process, I try to change the perspective, and it's higher and higher. And this one is all my friends, they want to be part of my work. So the best thing here is you do anything stupid on the street, people ask, you can say, oh, I'm making art. That's good. And so at this moment, I started to think about anything I can pull out from my previous experience and not really focus on photography, or I can use this as a tool. So I'm thinking of, I did a lot of work with Google Map, and also it's quite, how to say, it's quite early before it's popular on the smartphone. By the way, I didn't have a smartphone when I was in SBA. So every time I want to go out to somewhere, I have to check the Google Earth all the time. And I gradually found it's interesting because all the images on the screen is different. There's a suburban construction is so compelling to me. So I try to pull out and make a series, like a study on the suburban housings. And those are all in New Jersey. So I tried to make them like a plan form. So it's a series of work I've been working on. And at the same time, I was working on another project. It's called reconstruction. So I pulled out all the constructions on the islands along the Eastern River. So you can see the Statue of Liberty on the left side, and all the way like all the prisons in the Rikers Island on the right side. So it's I made it like a skyline, like a rebuild a skyline, because it's never going to happen in this way. And also this is another piece I pull out the piers along the Manhattan and reconstruct, make it like a skyline and like a imaginal skyline. And these are all the piers along Brooklyn. And combine both of them. And at that time, I was living in Queens, and so there are so many cemeteries in Queens. And sometimes I walk around in the cemeteries, I said, I should do something with that. So this is one of the cemeteries called Mount Zion in Queens. So it's the aerial view of the cemetery. So each dot represents one graveyard or one tombstone, and you can see how many people buried there. Like you can say more dead people live in this neighborhood than are living. And this is close by, and you can see all the dots. So I made a series of them till now. So this is the New Calvary Cemetery. There's a scene of Godfather there, I think. So during my school, I think it's from Penelope, it's over there, and she suggests me to do the laser cutting. So it's just like something good when you're here, you can use everything. It's much cheaper. So I tried with that and started to work on this project. It's called Suburban Form. And the idea is, usually we say suburban housing is the invasion to the nature, but if you see human being as part of nature, that's natural. So I pull out those constructions, and I in the previous project, suburban housing, and reconstruct with vines. And this is what I think the first show I've done in work, yeah. So also I like to work with space, so it's just growing out from the closet. So it's actually an alternative space. So I'm glad it works well, yeah. So close by you can see the swimming pool, so everybody's so excited. And this is the second show I made, and it's in the place in Patterson, and it's an ancient factory, so the ceiling's really high, like 22 feet, and so I try to work with that. It's really challenging, but the result I was satisfied. So I'll say I was lucky to get this fellowship because I just submitted one project, but in different places, yeah. And then I moved into another show, and it's even challenging because it's really like a 26 feet higher, so I have to use the lifter the first time. So at this moment, I just try to make more shows and more make things bigger and bigger. And then I have an opportunity to show in the gallery finally. Because those are all like alternative spaces, and it's working well with my project. But right now I have to do something more neat, I have to say. So for this show, I show with those prints all together, and I try not to use the natural materials. And this is another show in the QCC gallery. So it's a gallery on the CUNY system. So I use another pattern of those suburban housing to build another construction. And then another show, I show with the prints and with another pattern. So the good thing to work with installation is temporary. And every time you have to make it is fun, but the things left is only the photographs. So then I have this show with Chashama. It's a huge space in the Holland. You can see it's like 57 foot long. And it used to be a retail store. So, and the show has to be seen 24/7. So it's really challenging, and you can see the result. And I didn't use the vines, so only fishing lines. So also as a photographer, you need to make good photographs. It's really helpful. So the idea is you can physically wander in the structure, and you can think about what's going on, what you have done to the earth. And think about that, reconsider your surroundings. That's the idea. And this is the show I made in the EFA, Elizabeth Foundation. I was selected as a member in 2017. But unfortunately, I was screwed with the H1 visa, so I had to move out. And the lawyer suggested me to have solo shows, and so there's a solo show. And in the solo show, I made another installation. So I combined two patterns and play with a different form. Yeah. So I want to show you more about the different projects, and this is one project I was commissioned in New York, and it's a hallway between the New York Penn Station and the building. So there are 30,000 passengers walk by every day, so it's really challenging. And you have to be seen 24/7. So I tried not to use the images this time. And for me, it's a good opportunity to showcase to try something. So it's the daytime. And this is another kind of public project I made in New York too. But you can see the scaffolder because there was a huge storm and all the building collapsed. So I never took the good picture from the front because there's a scaffolder. So I used the vines and with the external cables, and the cables is actually from that local space. So this is another project I made during the North Foundation residency. So I think this is the only colorful piece for me. So I used the recycled external cables and with the duct tape. It's during an opening. And then I got an opportunity to show in Seoul, and I did some research on that, and I was surprising that they're so interested in living in a well-built, high apartment. So I make a project on that, I pull out all the images from the aerial view and print it on stickers. Thing about that is I don't want to bring any materials after the show back. So I try to do it this way. So it's more like a mirror, and also it's a trial, but it's a showcase. So again, I was really lucky. The curators, they trusted me. And then with that experience, I have another project. Actually, I made these images with, it's a first level town in New York. So I withdraw all the houses from the aerial view, and the work is from 2013 to 14. So it's kind of a labor-related work. So close by, you can see the details, but I withdraw all the natural and the natural part and the road. And then with that, I reconstruct these houses. It's also a mural piece. Those are also stickers. So I try to make the suburban housing more organic, in an organic way. So it's the close view. So this is the latest project I made. So thank you for listening.
I realized that I forgot to put on.
Missing 3 minutes for
That's what the Mystic 3 Minutes were from, exactly. I'm just going to take 1 minute. Just indulge me 1 minute, because it's a very important project apropos tonight's conversation. I don't know how that happened, that it fell out. But in terms of lens-based practice in architecture, let's see. Hold on. Full screen. This is a project where I was involved from the very beginning of the building's inception in San Francisco. I don't know why this, here, this is where I want it to be, okay, thank you. San Francisco built a new police headquarters, and then they had a competition to create a memorial for San Francisco police officers who had fallen in the line of duty. And I was awarded the commission in 2011. It took 4 years to build it, the whole thing. But I was working with the architects of the building. It's a huge complex. And I created this large suspended glass cylinder. It weighs 9,000 pounds. Think about what happened to my sleep when I learned that I was responsible liability-wise for the next 27 years. I solved that problem, but it made me sort of anxious. It's in the lobby of the new police headquarters, and it's cast glass with ceramic frit text. That's when you look straight up into an oculus. Ceramic frit text of a poem that I wrote together with a writer named Margot Perrin, and then with surviving family members of fallen police officers. So that's just a project I thought that actually, it's one of the few projects that I've done in public spaces that is permanent. It's a permanent piece. And doing permanent public art has its own sort of agonies and ecstasies, which we'll skip at the moment. But thank you. Thanks for that.
Well, thank you both for those very deeply moving presentations and insights into your artistic ideas and your creative practices. As we begin this dialogue, I just wanted to, again, reiterate the frame that Liz and Charles gave to us tonight about discussing lens-based work as the foundation towards architectural design in the practices of these two artists. And just kind of layering on that frame, there have been many connections made between other architecture and other art forms. Architecture and music, for example, architecture is frozen music, as Goethe once said, or architecture and dance, dance being the first art form made with the human body, and architecture, in other words, shelter, as the first art form made outside the human body. And in this talk, we will attempt to connect lens-based practices with architecture or the built environment in general. I think this talk is very timely as we continue to re-examine our relationship with space in the constructed world. It's important to move architecture out of the province of architects and find more inventive, holistic, and community-based practices, particularly practices that engage the public in thoughtful dialogue about topics that are often taken for granted, such as housing and commutes, to surveillance and humanity's ecological footprint. Architects have often surrendered a sense of agency as artists. They're reliant on clients, subject to regulations, overly sensitive to politics, and all this is partly due to the enormous capital expenses required in realizing a building. So some of these architectural problems or rooms for improvement within the profession could be architecture as a means of political power and propaganda, as recounted in books such as Calvino's Invisible Cities or Dejan Sujic's The Edifice Complex. Architecture's involvement with the colonial project. Architecture and labor rights, from the poor conditions of immigrant labor here in the United States to South Asian labor building skyscrapers in the Middle East. architecture's involvements with surveillance system or barrier walls, architecture and development as a contributor to climate change. Some estimates say 40% of all greenhouse gases are produced in the building trades. Architecture's engagement with gentrification and an increasing emphasis on creating luxury products as part of that process. And I'm not even mentioning Hudson Yards here. So what is architecture? Architects typically define architecture versus sculpture as occupiable space, and all that entails, from structure, weatherproofing, plumbing, electricity, and that's what separates it from other art forms. Evelyn Waugh in Brightside Revisited talks about creating architecture as the highest art form because of its permanence. Frank Lloyd Wright, of course, being an architect, thought of it as the master art form. And architects often look askance at other people adopting that title, especially software architects. And however, in my practice, as it's evolved, I've become more skeptical of architecture having to be realized as a building form. It can be, other kinds of projects that engage the community, neighborhood planning, grassroots economic development, providing cultural resources to a neighborhood, mitigating conditions like having a highway running through your neighborhood and what you do in that instance. So I've been increasingly thinking of architecture as a process, and in kind of ways that resonates with what you've been doing here in your work, thinking through your process first as photographers, as lens-based practitioners, and thinking of how to elevate that or to increase that scope into a three-dimensional spatial context. And when we spoke, you had a very interesting idea of hardware versus software, hardware being a built form, architecture versus software being some kind of community development. So I think it was a very interesting aspect that you brought to our conversation, Ming-Jer. And so some themes in both of your works, just responding to some of the work I've seen today and also in the past. There's a sense of abstraction in both your projects. The refugees' interior thoughts. Abstraction, yeah. And in Ming-Jer, the suburban landscape abstracted into an organic form. There's also a process of distillation involved. The individual in Night Watch is a haunting, almost disembodied presence in a dark backdrop versus, Ming-Jer, the reorganization of suburban space into these spiraling organic forms. And another kind of distillation is almost like the distillation of strands of DNA. You're both taking form to its intrinsic parts, the human body and the human house, distilled almost in the same process that scientists distill strands of DNA from cells. And of course, there's that political engagement that both of you have. Shimon, there's a very political presence in some of your work, especially, the way you activate landscapes with text or projections. Ming-Jer, you cite the issue of the suburban form, and it kind of causes us as the public to engage with it and think about what suburbia means. And I grew up in the suburbs, so there's this sense of isolation, terrible land use, wasted space, shopping malls, golf clubs, golf courses. So there's a kind of political engagement there that you're having in your work. And there's also a subversion, I think, as another kind of theme here. So in Shimon, your Night Watch, one of the commentators or participants looked at the work as putting faces where numbers usually are. That's something that one of the participants took away from that project. And again, Ming-Jer, you're inviting us to look at something, the suburban shape that we've seen so many times, and looking at it more thoughtfully through your distillation and reorganization. And also, I think there's a theme of social change that's at work here. You're, Shimon, inviting us to look at refugees and their presence, their vibrance, what they add to our dialogue and discourse not just something to be feared or something to be set aside. And Ming-Jer, again, you're looking at deeper connections to human settlement through your work. And so, kind of broadening that into a dialogue here, I wanted to ask you, Shimon, about some of the tools that you use. Memory plays a strong role in your work, and you realize memory in a built form in a really intriguing, evocative way. So can you describe your process in manifesting memory into three-dimensional space?
Is this turned on? No, is that better?
Yeah.
That's a very, that question is it's a big question. And answering it would be very, would be like peeling away the layers of an onion. It's very layered. Because in some projects I respond first and foremost to the site, to the place, right? Like for example, the Writing on the Wall project in Berlin in the former Jewish neighborhood. I had no idea it was a Jewish neighborhood at first, and I was just walking the streets of that neighborhood, and something was, I couldn't shake something. I was feeling something, but I couldn't see it. And then when I found out it had been a Jewish neighborhood, and my grandfather was from Berlin, but what was the fuel behind that project was that I was trying to. There was a gap between what I felt and what I could not see, and I couldn't take my finger from that. And so what fueled that project was a motivation to actually give visual form to what I felt but couldn't see. But every project is different. With Night Watch, it's about memory, but it's also about our present and our future. When Michaela from More Art approached me about doing a public piece here, I thought for a few months, and I considered what was most urgent for me, and this topic for me was very, very urgent. And I was also keen to do a water piece again. I've done water pieces before. I didn't show them today, and I halfway regret that now. But so sometimes the site is what leads. Sometimes it's issues related to the content. I tend to mostly use it, except for the memorial, the permanent memorial. I tend to use ethereal media, whether it's a video projection, or in the old days, the slide projection, the Berlin project, that was done with like Kodak cameras of slide projectors in the early 90s, or with temporary light box pieces. And I use ethereal, or the laser projections in Between Dreams and History. There's a number of different media that I've worked with, and I use these media. I'm kind of going with your question. I use these media because, on one hand, they are material, and so they have a substance. I see it. On the other hand, I see that image. I see that projection. I see that writing. On the other hand, it's just photons. It's immaterial. So it's that dual two sides of the coin of material, immaterial, that to me is very reflective of how human memory works. Our memories are very, very substantial to us. They seem to have a substance, a three-dimensionality, but who knows? It's probably just fluid transmission, right? I'm overstating it, but so that's kind of as good a question as I can give you without us having a 2-hour conversation.
We can have that. You mentioned water, and in Night Watch, you speak of water as safe passage, a place to, of refuge, but it could also be a risk. So we've seen IOA do projects, talking about the risks refugees face crossing bodies of water. And of course, there's the risk of climate change. We know from Hurricane Sandy that we're all at risk here living in an island. So have you thought about playing with that sensibility of both risk and refuge with water?
Well, I'm smiling for a reason, because as I mentioned, I only selected 3 or 4 projects, right? But it wasn't my last project, but two projects ago, before Night Watch, I made an art film, an 8-minute art film with 7 Syrian refugees who had just crossed the Mediterranean on rafts and were fortunate enough to arrive safely in Europe. And we filmed it, and half of my family comes from Syria, which was helpful actually. But we filmed it in a former gambling casino in Europe that is a Kunsthal, like an art museum today. And I filmed them around a roulette table. And they're playing this kind of metaphoric game of casino roulette and making their bets, etc., placing their bets, etc., as a artistic distillation for the forces of life and death that are outside of one's control, especially people who gamble their lives by doing dangerous things like crossing a huge sea in a raft. If you want to see that piece, there's an excerpt from it on my website. It's called The Crossing. But I'm smiling just because that's exactly what that project dealt with, was risk and refuge, exactly that.
And Ming-Jer, memory also plays a role in your work, because you're drawing from growing up in urban core of Taipei, you're drawing from that to create a kind of fascination of suburban America. So it's a kind of new form for you and experiencing it. But yet there's also a lot in terms of refugees that percolates through your work, because some of the landscapes, cityscapes that you're familiar with in Taiwan are the result of providing housing for refugees fleeing the Chinese Civil War from mainland China coming to Taiwan. Can you talk about that experience and how that impacts your work and your fascination with American suburbs?
Yeah, I was asking about the suburban projects all the time. Like, have you lived in the suburbia? No, of course not. But I've seen that in the movies all the time, and it's like you need to have a backyard, and you need to have flowers in front of your house, and good, nice cars, and a beautiful woman. So I don't know. It's so compelling to me when I was here and looking at those Google Earth, like, wow, it's incredible. We have nothing like this in Taiwan. And the scale is so stunning that motivated me to do this project. And from my memory, because I grew up in the center of Taipei City, it's like so compact. And so from my childhood, I always working in the streets and into the land, and I always can figure out a good way to get somewhere in a really shortcut. And so I also like to be a farmer in the streets, so we can see all the photographs I've shown you, and people put things on the road because it's too compact. And the thing you mentioned about is the refugees, they fled from the Civil War to Taipei, and it's kind of to Taiwan actually. It's like 2 million people in a short term of time. So there's a lot of requirement for living in a short time. So at a certain of time, they cannot offer the living for these so many people, and so it's horrible. And later, there's a certain period of time they started to have support from the U.S. So they started to build up some apartment. And the funny thing is, why the Civil War caused, because there's a conflict between as a KMT and the communists. And but the social housing is the idea from the Soviet Union, you know. So it's like if they use that idea to build those buildings, and they would say no, but it's from the U.S., so they say yes, and they get the financial support. So suddenly they have a lot of similar houses. It's tiny, but it's compact, but it's livable. So it's kind of a suddenly change in the landscape of the cities. And I was stunned by that when I was walking in the street. Yeah, that's part of my memory. And then also when I was doing the project, I looked back the history. I found something interesting because after the Civil War and the refugees, that really helped me about when I was shooting.
Another big influence on your work is your career as an engineer, especially in your ideas about data analysis and aerial photography. Can you describe some of that?
Actually, I use a lot of information visualization. So because I did I work for the government about pollution control, like air pollution. It's something that you cannot see, but it exists. So how you demonstrate those things, you have to have a lot of numbers, a lot of graphics, a lot of photographs. So I think that helped me about the creative process. Like I'm good at using those things to demonstrate my idea in some way. And also I mentioned about the Google Earth and some GPS. I was always driving because we need to do the site survey. So I drove all the time, and you have to. Sometimes you get lost because you don't know where you are, and there's a pollution there. You have to position it. So there's something about lost and found, and something invisible because it's only numbers. So that's part of the things like what I've done. I took the patterns and rebuilt something invisible. And after that, we can talk about that's somewhere, but you cannot recognize at the beginning. But you have to see the detail, and that's why I try to make it in my work. Yeah.
And does that career as an engineer cause you to kind of always think about, the wasted space of suburbia? Is that something that you're analyzing by taking out a lot of the additional space and just distilling it down to the houses? And we are very intrigued now because we want to know at least I want to know what kind of stories are happening, what kind of domestic stories are happening in those houses. But is that part of your thinking about distilling it to that?
I think for my process, I didn't really bring it up. Like I'm really interested in those forums, and I would look at those, look into some articles or some news about the suburbia, and something good, something bad, actually. So I think during the process, I acquired those knowledge and to reveal those things and made my process more interesting. But not really something I want to say, actually. But I will just try to cite the question, what do you think about the suburbia? And because one thing is also, I don't have that experience, but everything on the screen is so beautiful. So something I want to bring it up in the work, yeah. So the form has to be looking good. So, yeah.
And Shimon, I wanted to ask you, as a fan of old master paintings, you're borrowing the title for Night Watch from Rembrandt's Night Watch?
No, I've actually been asked that before. No.
Okay, because I found some interesting resonances with that painting. So.
Oh.
Yeah, so it's, for example, the use of light and shadow, and you've described that work as Caravaggio-esque.
Right.
So Rembrandt's Night Watch is a painting from 1642. Happen to have it printed out over here. And there's the play of light and shadow, the sense of movement. So instead of a typical group portraits of that time were very static, so there's a sense of movement towards the picture plane, which you have in your work. It depicts a militia engaged in urban surveillance, so you're turning that idea on its head.
Right.
There's also what scholars think that is possibly more of an actual day painting, but it's darkened with time, similar to our policy towards refugees. So, am I reading
Well,
into that?
Right. Well, no, it's very interesting. I wasn't thinking about the painting per se, but I was thinking about surveillance. I was thinking about guarding, gazing at nighttime, borders,
Right.
protecting borders, like a night sentry.
Right.
And then just the act of looking and encountering the other at nighttime. So those are the kinds of things that I thought about in terms of the title.
Right.
Yeah.
And not to leave Ming-Jer out in terms of my extracurricular activities.
Free association.
So, one way that urban designers use data is, and especially when they're engaging in community development work, is data can be a very powerful tool to analyze urban forms. So here is a map of Manhattan with childhood asthma rates located. And so the darker the color, the higher the incidence of childhood asthma admittance into hospitals. And then mapped on top of that are different kinds of pollution-causing uses. MTA bus depots, DOT diesel truck sites, marine waste transfer stations, bus terminals, sanitation facilities. And as you can see, when you look closely at this, is that those are typically in areas of color, or neighborhoods where people of color live, often poorer areas. So you can see that correlation between higher incidence of childhood asthma and then poorer areas. But a community can use this then to go to City Hall and say, look, you've got these terrible uses in our neighborhood. What will you give us back? Will you give us a park? Will you give us a school? So it can be a very powerful tool in terms of visualizing data. So have you ever thought about that broader context? Where do you want, both of you, your work to go? Do you want it to then, create a dialogue with people who might actually be building cityscapes? Shimon, would you want, your work to then create more housing for refugees? The architects that think about housing for refugees. Do you have any ideas for your data to be used as a community tool in this way, a community benefits tool in this way?
Also, for now, I haven't thought about that, but I just, because you mentioned about that last time, and there's just one map about the cancer patient rates in Taiwan too. So it's like the poor area, they have higher rates about the disease. So that's something I think it was to work on that, but with our practice, I haven't thought about that.
Shimon?
Well, that's always a tricky topic in terms of, or a complex topic in terms of, art and social change, if I reframe it. And every artist, of course, navigates that differently. Clearly, in some ways, my work is seen as interventionist and political, but I typically feel that I'm working in the realm of the imaginary, and I'm cautious about art's claims to create social change. Doesn't mean it doesn't, but I'm cautious about being very instrumental about it. So I try not to approach a project where I have a change in the world as an end result that I'm aiming for. I'm mostly trying to just make a good work of art. But of course, we only have one lifetime, and we only get to make a certain number of art projects and bodies of work, and there are things that we deeply care about. So, yes, I mean, it's all about, you know, tikkun olam, making a better world, hopefully. Sorry, that was Hebrew, you know, but repairing the world, healing the world. Yes, I would hope, for example, with Night Watch, that a project like that would help to increase awareness of the other, and the other is actually not that different than myself. And the other is also not out there, but is amongst us, is my neighbor next door, is my employer, is my employee, is my friend. Or likewise, let's say with my other projects, Between Dreams and History in the Lower East Side, or The Writing on the Wall in Berlin, the sense that the past, present, and future are really a continuum. It's the way that the human mind compartmentalizes it. So I'm someone for whom the past is always with us, and is always with me, and memory and history are very important as values to me. So is that political? I think it is. I mean, you know, a sense of history is inseparable from politics or political consequences, you know, in terms of the lengths to which different regimes and countries go to either erase history, or in the case of, let's say, post-war West German history, to have a whole sort of a memory industry that you build of monuments and whatnot in relation to the Second World War. So I would say in a general sense, yes, my hope is that my projects would increase awareness, would lead to social change, but I'm not really instrumental. I'm working a bit more like a poet, experientially, with the kinds of things I think about. Because that would be, you know, it's kind of a crapshoot how the world responds to these things sometimes. But, so this is what I would hope for, indeed. And that's why I choose to make art about these political and social subjects that I care about. But I'm modest in terms of my expectations about what kinds of social change art can actually create.
Great. We've got about 10 minutes left. Are there any questions for? Yes.
Without a mic? Yeah, here.
Oh, yes, somebody would know, sorry.
Hey, so my question is from Shimon. You've worked with like architecture, like where humans inhabited. Also you talked about making the world a better place, and also you placed your installation in water. Water is also a very human element. So I'm just curious to know your definition about human. What is the definition of human in this post-modern world, this contemporary time, in context of what's happening in Kashmir or wherever, Syria or Iran, wherever?
I guess I have to reframe the question in terms of the way I think about these things, because maybe
like what the human is going towards annihilation, or the
what do I think about humanity?
Yep.
Because I was first going to go somewhere else. I was going to say I think more about human values. What are human values? And humanistic values. This is something I think. One thing that I think a lot about is sort of shared common humanity, and that's.
I'm more concerned about the alienation towards
destruction.
Yep.
Yeah. No. I know. I was first giving you the soft gauzy part of it, but well, I mean, I'll be honest. I'm not very optimistic, given our current world that we're living in. It's a very dark time. I mean, it's extremely dark. You know, I don't want to say something too nihilistic, but there's not really a lot of reason for optimism at the moment, except of course resistance forces. You know, the community that sort of resists what's going on and trying to proactively write a different future. But it is very troubling, and it's crossing a lot of international boundaries all over the world. I'm currently working on a project in Brazil, which I didn't discuss, but I don't see it being very related to architecture, but it sort of relates to Donald Trump, Jair Bolsonaro, the Brazilian fascist president, and Mel Brooks. It's true, it's crazy, right? And Brazilian dance. So, but I only mention that just to say that this is in fact something that I think about like 24 hours a day. I'm not that optimistic at the moment, but you know, maybe we have some surprises in store. Have a good kind. I don't know, what about you?
I mean, I think the same, but in terms of like you laid the answer very what do I call, not so positive. You chose your words very, I don't know, carefully, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think the same, but very in the core, deeply with not such positive words. I mean, it's
Right.
because this is a serious matter.
Right.
Every day people are dying, and we are just because I'm coming from a background where this is a serious matter. That's why this is important for me to ask you, because you are someone who's not making art for the sake of art. You are making something. The speech you gave made me compel me to ask this question to you. So
It's a very central thing. I mean, it's a very core issue in terms of what in the hell is going on in our world today. Did we not learn any of the most basic lessons of the 20th century? And 100 million people dying from war. How could this be happening? But I don't want to go there. So, no, I'm sorry. No, but hopefully our creative work and our artistic activity and many other forms of intellectual and creative activity is a more positive force. And when done collectively across millions and millions of people and combined with action, this is our hope. So.
Yes.
This is a follow-up question for Shimon. I was very moved by the photographs and the installation of those recent asylum seekers. Were some of them fearful about being having their photographs in such a public place in New York City for the world? Did some people turn you down? How did you select your subjects?
Mm-hmm. That's a very good question. It's too bad Michaela's not here anymore, because I work together with more, for all of my community-based works, we work at least for 3 or 4 months just on the community engagement part, in terms of finding the organizations and the advocacy groups, and then meeting their clients, and kind of introducing them to what I want to do, and hopefully getting them excited and inspired, and bringing them along, and getting them to want to participate. It's interesting what, I'm going to answer your question, but I want to first say, the last project, the one you didn't see but that I described, the art film with the 7 Syrian refugees, that was much more an issue with that project, because they were afraid that somehow the film might be seen in Syria and it could harm their families.
Or the television clip of this.
Yeah, exactly.
Or somebody walking the streets of the waterfront in New York who knew somebody way back.
Right.
I mean, that may be small chance, but I wondered if you
Right.
understand.
Well, in terms of the crossing, the project before, it did come up and took quite some conversations. With Night Watch, less so, and there's a very specific reason. All of 11 people in the project, or maybe it was 12 now, all of the participants in the project had already had their asylum applications approved. They were safe. So they had nothing to fear. No,
But maybe they weren't safe where their family was.
I hear what you're saying, but I'm just telling you how no, I know. Yeah, they were safe here. You have to understand, they fled their countries because whatever secret they were hiding, or whatever political action they were doing, it was discovered and they were persecuted and they ran. So the news already came out in their home countries. You see? Like the worst already happened. It was known, and that's why they fled. So on this side of the different ponds, the different oceans, it was more just an issue of their status here would not in any way be harmed or put in jeopardy by participating, because they had their asylum applications approved. They were kind of, it's interesting, both with Night Watch and also with the crossing, what really excited them was the fact that it was a way of telling their story, but it wasn't journalism. They're used to like reporters talking to them, or news broadcasters. It was a completely different genre. And they kind of got excited about it, like the idea of the 20-foot wide portrait of them on a boat floating along the banks of Manhattan and Brooklyn, like that. They kind of got into the craziness of that, which was fun.
You said many of them were in the gay community.
Yeah.
That's really gay now.
Most of them, not all of them, but most of them. Maybe, I don't know, out of 12, maybe 9. Yeah.
Any other questions?
Sure.
I just wanted to, Shimon, kind of to branch off of that. I was sort of wondering about your own personal history in the choice of your subjects, and when you decide to choose people or where they're from, how much of it is based on their relation to your own personal history, or when you choose to pick a subject that maybe is more of the other, if you do ever.
Right. When you say subject, you mean like the topic of a project?
Well, like you said, you had family from Berlin.
My mother's side.
Yeah, and then you had family from Syria, and so I could see the natural inclination to want to talk about those things. But then,
right.
So when is it, something that is a personal history and a memory, and when is it something that is?
Well, there's always, these are never sort of binary. It's always A plus B plus C, not A or B. So almost always I have a personal connection to the topic. I mean, the Lower East Side project, both of my grandparents, when they landed in this country, their first stop was the Lower East Side. So there's always, and Israel, the facts on the ground. I spent my formative years living there, and I was so deeply dented and troubled by the political nightmare of that situation and occupation. And so, I mean, these are all things that I care about, both sort of related to my personal biography, but also, as an artist, my values, my ethics. I have to be very careful how I word this, what I'm about to say, and I'm probably going to regret it. No, because I'm taking your questions to heart. I think the hardest one in that sense was the police memorial. That was a little bit of a bigger stretch. I mean, just more, you know, I'm a lefty, and whatever, just, that one was a little bit more of a stretch. And it's the closest I ever came to feeling like artist for hire, you know, in a way. I mean, it was a very big commission, so it was helpful to live from that for several years. But that one may be a little less so, except my hometown is San Francisco. And so it gave me an excuse also to spend a lot of time going home. And my twin sister is there, and close friends from art school are there, and I have a lot of history there. So, but anyway, no, it's a good question. It's always sort of, you know, complicated when we as artists talk about our biography in relation to our work. I'm typically kind of shy of doing that. When I mention it, like I mentioned the Syria, that my father, I said part of my family is my father's family is from Syria. I sometimes mention that proactively as a way of maybe inoculating myself against a certain, like, well, what is your relation to those people, or who are you to talk for, you know, that kind of thing. But I want to just say that I want to sort of pivot a little bit and answer a side question that actually wasn't asked, which is that none of my community-based projects would happen if the participants weren't into it. You know, like with the 7 Syrian refugees, when I was meeting with them in Europe, and I was meeting with them in Red Cross dormitories and in crazy places. And I would tell them, I said, look, I'm from New York, I was invited here to do a project, here's what I'd like to do. I know it sounds crazy, but my thought is, you know, film you doing this kind of silent game of of casino roulette. It's very stylized how we filmed it. It's kind of slow-mo, they're moving very slowly, very robotically. Again, I encourage you to look at it. But do you think this is a crazy idea? And you know, my thought is that maybe it reflects your experience in terms of the things that are outside of your control and the roll of the dice in terms of whether one lives and whether one dies. And I would always be very nervous for the 15 minutes or so explaining the project, my idea, because if they said they didn't like it, it wouldn't happen. Well, so I'd look at them, and usually they're listening, they're very poker-faced while they're listening. And then also with the night watch, they were also very poker-faced while they're listening. No visible responses. So I never know what they're going to say when I finally shut up. And the Syrians said to me, they said, Shimon, this is exactly our experience. That it's a game of roulette, the whole thing. We made it. We didn't drown in the Mediterranean. We made it, but we know many people who did not. And likewise with the participants in Night Watch, they liked the idea. They also thought it was kind of important, like from a political sense, to give greater visibility to their community. So.
Well, even collaborating with the families of the police officers, I thought too.
That was really intense. We can talk about it more off the record sometime.
My questions was Shimon. You discussed something about a project where 7 refugees come from Europe, I guess?
Syria. 2 years.
To Europe.
Yeah.
And your project, Night Watch,
Yeah.
is it somewhat related to that project? Did it influence your project about like displaying all those refugees on a raft, or like they came on a raft from Syria to Europe, and this one, Night Watch, it's about displaying refugees on a boat. So is there an influence of your past projects on your future projects?
It's really interesting. It's a very interesting question. I'm smiling because because in between, again, I only showed you 3 or 4 projects, but I do a lot of projects. In between, I did a project for the St. Louis Art Museum, which was partly about Huckleberry Finn, Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn on the Mississippi River, and Ferguson, Missouri, where Michael Brown was killed. Part of what triggered the Black Lives Matter movement, and the museum is like equidistant between those two. Played like 7 minutes by car from the beach. And in the installation that I created was a cast resin sculpture of a raft, a floating raft, but you didn't know, it looks like a Huckleberry Finn raft, but it also looks like an ambulance or a police vehicle. It's kind of a hybrid a little bit. And I wasn't thinking about, I wasn't consciously aware of the connections before or connections after, but then like when the curators from the St. Louis museums came later and saw Night Watch, they said to me, Shimon, but you had a raft in that piece was called Lost in Space. There was a raft in Lost in Space, and here it is again. Look at that connection, isn't that interesting? The honest answer, I wasn't conscious about it. What's happening in our murky underbellies of the unconscious is a whole different matter. So.
Yeah, I have an observation and a question for Ming-Jer. I was fascinated by the fact that both of you seem to have a common theme about feeling things that are not visible and then making them visible. Shimon, with you, with your psychogeographic walk in Berlin, not realizing it was Jewish or giving some substantial aspects to memory. Ming-Jer, I noticed when you start out descriptively in terms of your systems analysis, they were very literal and very geometric. And then this interesting change to the curvilinear. And I was just wondering, it seems to me that, where you take great deal of pride of having worked on the street and based on observation, but then you change it, and it becomes beautiful. And I'm just wondering if there's anything to that. If you could speak about that transition from the geometric and the hard edge and then back into the very your great attention to the detail and the beauty of the whole thing.
It's kind of difficult because I don't even think about that. I think if I want to think about that, it's because it's a huge U-turn of my own life. So I kind of want to get rid out of something like I won't say photography, but kind of. Charlie's not here. Okay. So once I get out of that, so I was thinking about what's the next. So I think that's why it's like something makes no sense for the creator, but also makes sense. Like I use something familiar to explore something unfamiliar. I don't know if that makes sense. And also for the suburban project, for me is also, if I will put it, it's like a anxiety of my pressure here. Like I moved here to I have nothing here, so I can create something that the viewer is familiar. For me, it's not familiar. I try to, but I was taking that as a tool to explore the detail or the background knowledge about, for example, the Levittown history or the suburban or the issues like racial things, a lot of issues, and also urban, no, it's not urban, it's environmental unfriendly. So I would say I take it as a tool to go inside and to understand the urban as a culture. And with that, I can bring that to the next step. Like recently, I had to went back and stay longer and started to explore what's the urban culture of my place. Then with that, I can bring into another project. I think it's kind of the part of sees like a tool to go to the next step. Yeah. I don't know if that makes sense.
Well, it's interesting that you said that patterns reveal something that's invisible. So I was trying to understand what it was that you're now making apparent and what you're making visible. With Shimon, we were able to see that fairly immediately because of the relationship to the history and the sense of place and time. But yours is far more abstract, it seems. So that's why the question.
Any other questions? Well, I think we'll close the evening. I'm sure the artists will speak afterwards if you want to come up. But thank you all for coming. Thank you, Shimon and Ming-Jer, for your presentations.
Yeah.